We now come to the backbench motion on plastic bottles and coffee cups. To move the motion, I call Mary Cray.
Very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move the House has considered the first and second reports of the Environmental Audit Committee, plastic bottles, turning back the plastic tide, and disposable packaging, coffee cups, and urges the Government to adopt their recommendations as part of its resources and waste strategy. I'm grateful to you, Mr. Speaker, and to the Liaison Committee and the Backbench Business Committee for granting time in this House to debate the Environmental Audit Committee's reports on plastic bottles and coffee cups. And I want to thank my colleagues on the committee, some of whom are in their places, for their work on our inquiry last year. Today I want to talk about the scale of the plastic pandemic, the solutions we proposed, the importance of the EU circular economy package, and how we make producers responsible for their packaging. And can I begin, Mr. Speaker, by welcoming the announcement on Tuesday that Parliament will phase out most single-use plastics on our estate and introduce a 25p latte levy. I want to thank you, Mr. Speaker, and the Chair of the Administration Committee for your support in making this happen. Very good. We are in the middle of a global plastic pandemic. Plastic is everywhere, from the top of Mount Everest to the depths of the ocean to the North Pole. Plastic has been found in every species of animal in the Arctic, from plankton to polar bears. Research by Dr. Eric Van Sabeel at Imperial College London has shown that most of the UK's marine plastic pollution ends up in the Arctic, so the UK has a particular responsibility to clean up our act and protect the Arctic. Now, in 2015, the UK signed up to the UN Global Goals for Sustainable Development. Goal 12, Sustainable Consumption and Production. Goal 14, Protect our Oceans. The UK led in the development of those goals, but unfortunately, the government sometimes seems to think they're something for other countries, not for the UK. Our planet has only one ocean, wrapped around it like a cloak, and plastic bottles make up 1/3 of all plastic pollution in the sea. They break down into microplastics, which harm marine wildlife who eat them. And after my committee's groundbreaking work on rinse-off microbeads, which led the government to ban their manufacture and sale, we decided to examine single-use plastics, focusing on bottles and coffee cups. Single-use plastics take 5 seconds to make, 5 minutes to use, and 500 years to biodegrade. So when we throw them away, there is no such place as away. I give way.
I congratulate the Right Honourable Lady on getting this important debate, but have she or her committee come to a conclusion as to why the government is seemingly so resistant to biodegradable plastic technology, which was originally invented by Professor Scott at Aston University in the 70s? And does she, like me, not believe that the government actually have no strategy to deal with plastic which escapes into the environment already?
I have seen evidence about oxo-biodegradable, and I know there are a couple of different additives that you can add to plastics. What I would say is that the research on this is not conclusive about how and how fast it breaks down. I know it can break down in compostable, in sort of proper professional compostable machines, but the evidence of what happens out in the ocean is not that clear. And actually, we don't want an end-of-pipe problem. We don't want an end-of-pipe solution to this problem. What we want is something at the beginning that is sustainable. And I think there is a very live argument on this, and it's an argument going on at EU level between the plant-based plastics manufacturers of the South and then the people like us in perhaps the North who've got more of a petrochemical-based approach to these things. I'm not a scientist. I know the jury's out. I know that people who are scientists have looked at that. And I think what's important is that we develop policy that is correct and don't just look at what happens at the end of the pipe. In the UK, we recycle just 57% of our plastic bottles. It's higher for water bottles, but plastic bottles overall, it's 57%. We estimate that 700,000 plastic bottles are littered every day, spoiling our streets, threatening our wildlife and ruining our beaches. We're paying for its clean-up through our council tax. Keep Britain Tidy estimates that English councils spend £1 billion a year cleaning up after fly tippers and litter bugs. We recommended introducing a deposit return scheme on plastic bottles to boost recycling rates and create a clear stream of recycled plastic for manufacturers. When the Environment Secretary gave evidence to my committee in April, he told us we won't see that deposit return scheme until 2020, but it's better late than never, and we welcome his commitment. It's also important that we create a market for that recovered plastic, which is why we recommended that ministers set a target for 50% of recycled plastic to be present in new bottles. I'm pleased to see that Coca-Cola have committed to do that. Turning now to coffee cups, we use 2.5 billion coffee cups a year, enough to stretch around the planet 5.5 times. And before our inquiry, I, along with most other people, thought that coffee cups were recycled, but they're not. Their plastic coating, thinner than a human hair, means that most end up landfilled or incinerated. The coffee shop industry has told us that disposable coffee cups are recyclable, but recyclable doesn't mean recycled. Paper mills don't want them, plastics reprocessors don't want them. Just 1 in every 400 are recycled, 1/4%. And there are just 3 recycling plants in England that can recycle them. Moreover, if someone puts their coffee cup in a recycling bin, in a coffee shop or on the go, it won't be recycled and it could contaminate the other papers and plastics in the bin. I will give way.
She's making a very powerful speech with which I wholly agree. It seems to me that the principle that the polluter should pay is important, and that there are incentives for people, for individuals to do some of the tidying up as well. I remember as a child scuttling around on Saturdays collecting the bottles to return them to the local shop or off licence to get the return. So it helps, that sort of incentive helps to incentivise human behaviour. So does she agree with the polluter pays principle and that incentives are important?
Particularly agree, and happy days indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, collecting those bottles. By doing that, we create an army of litter pickers out in the streets. I was in Norway with NATO last week visiting the Arctic, and one of the they have a very full scheme there, a deposit return scheme there. One of the people we were talking to told me his son had made £580 last summer holidays, going on a little mission out on the streets every day. And I also noticed at the airport, when I was disposing of my single-use plastic bottle into their throwaway scheme, that the deposit was going to be collected by the Red Cross in Norway. So there's an opportunity here for charities to partner alongside on the deposit return scheme and find a valuable new income stream. I will give way.
Giving way because I'm going slightly off the point, but she did mention airports. One of the things, does she agree with me, that is little understood is that you are allowed to take your refillable container to an airport, and there are often places to refill it at the airport. People don't seem to be aware of this. Does she agree?
And I know Heathrow has introduced refill stations just on the other side of the security gates. But the problem is that people are usually in the queue before they realise they've got a full bottle of water, and you can't drink it. Most people can't drink half a litre sort of straight off. So I think airports could perhaps look at how we could dispose of those liquids and keep the bottles so we end up with more reuse. And that's a challenge for the airport and transport industry to think about today. Reducing and reusing is always better than recycling, and the 5p plastic bag charge has reduced plastic bag sales by 83% in the first year. So we know that charges change consumer behaviour. My committee recommended a 25p latte levy on disposable coffee cups to encourage people to bring their own cups. We want the money, the levy, to fund new bin infrastructure. Terrible. I'm trying not to murder the English language, but I think I've just stuck a nail in there. The Chancellor is consulting on a single-use plastics tax, and I look forward to reading the responses. The consultation closes tomorrow. Now, industry is stepping up to this. They know business as usual can't go on. Costa has introduced a recycling scheme which aims to recycle 500 million cups by 2020. Unfortunately, only 14 million cups last year, but it's a good start. Starbucks is trialling a 5p latte levy in 35 central London cafes, and in the first 6 weeks, reusable cup usage has more than doubled, which is very encouraging. But the truth is we need both. We need the latte levy and we need recycling schemes if we're going to tackle this problem. I will give way.
She's making a very powerful speech, and I'm also a member of the Environmental Audit Committee, and she's a wonderful campaigning chair, and it's a great honour to serve with her. Can I just draw you back? You're speaking about recycling. I was recently at a circular economy discussion where Waste Aid said that 2 billion people live without waste collection, 3 billion people live without proper waste recycling and reusage. And one of the big things he spoke about were plastic bottles in the developing world, where they used to use glass bottles. Would you like to comment? Would it be better in the developing world, perhaps, to use glass bottles?
I thank him for his contribution to the committee, where he is a fantastic and excellent and very constructive member, providing with challenge as well as cooperation, which is how we get to a good place and cross-party agreement. I remember visiting Juba in South Sudan in 2012 and noticing that there was very little water there for people and that all of the aid workers and visitors were using plastic bottles, no waste infrastructure whatsoever. And I think this is a really important problem because we know huge amounts of waste are thrown into rivers in Africa, in India, in the Far East, and we need to get that waste out of the rivers. How do you do it? You pay people. It's not just kids in the UK that will collect 5 or 10p plastic bottles. If you pay people, they will do the right thing, but they need the cash incentives to do so. And I think the UN has the opportunity with the International Climate Fund, which we all tend to think about green energy and clean energy and those sorts of things. I think we need to be looking at how some of those climate funds are allocated and spent at the supranational level and how our own UK aid budget can be used to help set up those systems to keep plastic out of the oceans, because there's only one ocean, as I said earlier, and we need to do more to protect it. I would give way.
Thank you very much for giving way on that point. Recently I went to Bangladesh, and along the whole of the beach there is litter, plastic litter sort of this high, waist high. It's huge. Wouldn't it be a good idea, and I have spoken to my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for DFID, if we spent some of our aid money paying people, as the Honourable Lady said, to clear up this mess, because it is going into the same ocean that we use and everybody else uses. And that way we would help them clean up their environment, help their tourism, because people would go to a clean beach, but they won't go to the filthy beach.
I agree with the Honourable Lady. She makes an excellent point, and of course Bangladesh is on the absolute forefront of climate change as well, so much of our aid budget is going in there to make homes more resilient, but obviously resilience in communities is also about giving people a good, clean, safe environment to live in and making sure that the poor have decent incomes. I give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way and for all the work she does on environmental issues, both here at home and internationally. And can I just say, it's not just beaches in Bangladesh, but we saw footage of beaches in Brighton being polluted by bottles. And can I ask if she agrees with me that local authorities need more support? There's excellent practice, but it's patchy, and that perhaps the government could consider some sort of grant scheme, citizens' grant schemes, to help people to take part actively around the country, to work with local authorities and corporates to clean up our beaches as well as streets, I should say.
I thank my honourable friend for that suggestion, which we actually made in our report on marine protected areas, and said that there should be a coastal communities fund in order for tourism to be developed and for communities to take ownership of the nature that surrounds them, the amazing nature. We don't have tropical rainforests in the UK, but we do have some of the world's best breeding sites for birds and all sorts of Ramsar wetland sites, and bringing communities closer to nature, to where they live, can only be a good thing. And I pay tribute also to the work that Sky Ocean Rescue has done in bringing the good activities that is going on both globally but also locally, right literally outside our own door, in cleaning up the Thames as well, to a much wider audience. We want the government to send a clear message to industry that all single-use coffee cups should be recycled by 2023, and if that doesn't happen, then they should simply be banned and we should move to a reuse cup system only. Consumers want to do the right thing. They deserve to know that companies are doing it too. But we also looked at the UK's packaging system, which we think needs a fundamental redesign. Producers of packaging should ensure their waste is dealt with according to the waste hierarchy: reduce, reuse, recycle. How do we make this happen? Well, at the moment, businesses who produce or use packaging have to show that they've recycled it by purchasing a packaging recovery note, PRN, from an accredited recycler or exporter. We heard evidence that system is a blunt instrument that does not reward design for recyclability, that does not penalise packaging that is difficult and costly to recycle. So we recommend the government reform PRNs. They should introduce a fee structure that reduces the cost of sustainable coffee cups and raises the cost of cups that are hard to recycle. The landfill tax and the PRN system have been the twin pillars of UK recycling for the last 20 years. 20 years ago, most of our waste went to landfill. Now we recycle almost half, but the recycling rates are stalling, and we need a new shot in the arm to bring it back to life. I will give way.
Thank you very well. She's a wonderful advocate for this. Would she accept, and if she doesn't have a look at the parliamentary question, I'll answer it, that the biggest problem at the moment is recycling is flatlining because it's all going into incinerators. That has to be dangerous in a time of air pollution.
Well, most of the waste that we recycle is actually exported, and the recent China waste ban sort of brought that home to people in a way that when they thought it was all going to be recycled somehow in the UK, and certainly brought home to members of this House when we visited Bywaters, the House's recycling company, and heard about the difficulties they were having. Now, some of those difficulties have alleviated, but his question about incineration, we visited an incinerator, and obviously it's better to get the calorific heat value from things rather than landfilling them, where we're going to have to dig them up in 10 or 20 years' time and incinerate them again, I'm afraid, such is the pressure on land use in this country. But of course, that we need to make sure that waste hierarchy is respected, and that, I think, is where the problems are coming, and people are telling me they're reopening their landfill sites and sending more to incineration. On the PRN system, the committee couldn't really see where the £100 million a year that the PRN system raises actually goes. So we've asked the National Audit Office to examine that system and follow the money and tell us where it goes. I want to turn now to the EU Circular Economy Package, which provides for a much more stringent extended producer responsibility scheme. At the moment, the UK has just 3 schemes covering electrical goods and cars, whereas France, Madam Deputy Speaker, has 14 covering furniture, tyres, mattresses and infectious healthcare waste. A mattress recycling scheme would create jobs in the heavy woolen industry in Wakefield, Ossett and Dewsbury. We need producers to be accountable for their products beyond the factory gates. We know that cigarette butts and chewing gum are the most frequently littered items in the country. Why are tobacco companies and sweet manufacturers not paying for the cost of their clean-up? Because it's always been this way. Well, I think we need to be working out how the polluter pays principle applies to the cigarette merchants and applies to the chewing gum brigade as well. This could save cash-strapped councils millions, and of course it would go directly to councils because they are the ones clearing up the litter, doing the gum busting on the streets, and they can perhaps present the gum manufacturers with the goo that they are steam cleaning off the streets. The Environment Secretary has told us he will commit to the EU's proposed target to recycle 65% of household waste by 2035. But what happens to that target after Brexit? Who enforces it? The new environmental oversight body will be able to issue advisory notices but not fines. It will not be able to take legal action, and it will not be ready for March 2019. Brexit weakens our waste system, and there was an interesting debate in the other place yesterday about whether people would still be able to bring cases to the European Court of Justice during that transitional period, where the Minister was not entirely clear whether that would be able to happen. So we will be watching that very, very carefully. So we've achieved a great deal, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've got the government working with Water UK to roll out a network of water refill points. We have supermarkets like Tesco, Sainsbury's, Morrison's, Aldi, Lidl and Waitrose launching a voluntary pledge to cut plastic packaging. The Treasury's consultation on a single-use tax closes tomorrow, and government departments have agreed to end the sale of single-use plastics, and Parliament is going to lead the way as well. A lot done, a lot to do. So, to conclude, we need to prevent waste from entering our environment. That would bring social, economic and environmental benefits. People are happier if streets and parks are litter-free. Our economy works better if we make smart use of limited resources, and our wildlife is protected if we keep plastic out of the sea. When people win, the economy wins and the environment wins. And I look forward to a good debate and hearing about the exciting work that colleagues have been doing in their local areas. Thank you.
Question is, as on the order paper, there are several colleagues who wish to speak this afternoon and limited time, but I hope that we can manage without a formal time limit, because debate flows much better if we don't have a formal time limit, but that means that I have to trust colleagues to take other people's points of view and right to speak into consideration. I'm sure that everybody here this afternoon is an honourable member and will do so. So can I make a plea that if speeches last around 7 or 8 minutes, then everyone who wishes to speak will have a chance to do so. If people speak for much longer than that, I will have to impose a time limit. I'm sure that I can trust Justine Greening to begin properly.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it really is an honour to be able to contribute to the debate this afternoon, because it's on a topic that certainly matters hugely to my own constituents with the River Thames, just in our local community as well. I would echo the points made by the Honourable Lady and pay tribute to the work that her Select Committee does. I think it's really led the way in this debate over recent years. And as she says, we have come a very long way. I remember just 2 years ago writing to all the major coffee houses in Southfields. She mentioned many of them, to ask them to trial a latte levy locally, because I felt that it's something our community would welcome. None of them were interested in doing it at the time. I remember writing to every single major supermarket in Southfields to ask them whether they would trial reducing plastic in packaging, but also allowing people to bring their own containers into supermarkets rather than constantly having to purchase particularly food and groceries with packaging that they didn't need. Met stony silence, but I do feel now like the tide is very much turning in the favour of all of these companies stepping up to the plate and starting to innovate. Locally, as a local MP, I've launched an initiative called the Putney Plastics Pledge, which is all about all of our community coming together to see what we can do to reduce our usage of plastic. And we've had a fantastic response from both shops and businesses, and we've had the Putney Business Improvement District getting involved in this. Waitrose has been part of the Putney Plastics Pledge, and I'd like to thank them for their efforts there. But also other parts of our local community, like the local pubs, and Young's Brewery is a fantastic a local business that runs many of our local pubs, and when it came to boat race day, they took the step of, for the very first time, switching away from the disposable plastic glasses that they often use on boat race day, and for the first time switching to recyclable plastic glasses that they will now be able to use not just in Putney on boat race day, but then down in Wimbledon for the tennis tournament down there. And I think it's these individual actions that businesses and companies are taking that are really going to make a big difference over time. But our Putney Plastic Pledge work has gone well beyond that, and our local university in Roehampton is now looking at what it can do to cut down. It's got a fantastic record on sustainability with the Roehampton Cafe that I regularly try and get a wonderful latte in myself. But they themselves, as students, are showing some leadership on this. And I should also pay tribute to our local schools. It was very much children in the Hotham Primary School Council and them asking me what we were doing at the end of last year about plastics, having seen Blue Planet, that really inspired me as a local MP to think, what can I do to help pull our community together to do more on this locally. And of course schools like Southmead are now setting about cutting down their plastic. They're designing a pledge logo that we can start to use, and tomorrow I will be visiting Riversdale Primary School in Southfields actually to see some of the work that they are doing. And I think so many of our actions are really aimed at looking to the future and protecting the environment that we want that generation to be able to become adults in. And this has really captured their imagination, and I think as much as anything else, showing that this is a parliament and also a government that's responding to their priorities is actually one of the most important aspects of this whole effort that I think we have in place. As I said at the beginning of this, it particularly matters to my local community. I think sometimes people have a sense that if you live in the city, somehow you're less interested in the environment, and actually nothing could be further from the truth. First of all, we really value our environment in my local community because we know that we need to take care of it. We have the River Thames right on our doorstep. We have the wonderful Wandsworth Park just next door. We have Richmond Park. I go running every week in Wimbledon Common. For us, protecting our environment is something that's hugely important to us. That's why after the boat race, we had a boat race clean-up, and as the Honourable Lady talked about just how much of a problem we have in our oceans, but also our rivers on plastic. And many of the items that we cleaned up after the boat race the day after were cotton buds, plastic bags, all sorts of things that were never going to degrade unless actually a human went and did a clean-up and actually picked them up and took them away, which is what we were doing that day. I'll just finish off by saying that I think we do have a long way to go on this. I think her challenge to business is one that I thoroughly support. Business can really be the innovator here on helping us all be able to cut down. I'd like business, particularly supermarkets, to allow consumers more choice so that they can more actively choose whether or not they want packaging by allowing containers to be taken into supermarkets. And I think there has to be a way around some of the health and safety laws that seem to get in the way of this being possible. And then finally, I would say that behavioural change, I think, is something that we need to continue to learn from. I have to admit, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I was delighted when we introduced the 5p levy on plastic bags, but I do have quite a lot of bags for life in my kitchen now, probably more bags for life than I'll really need over the course of my life. And I think we need to recognise that we're all on a journey in changing our behaviour, and actually research probably can inform what the next step is post the plastic bag levy to cut down on people like me having far too many bags for life. Finally then, I would simply say that my community really cares about the environment, and this issue of plastics, I think, has been a galvaniser for government. But I would simply say to the government bench that plastics is one of the things that we care about environmentally in Putney. Issues like air pollution and noise pollution and the impact that they have on public health matter to us just as much. And I think if the Secretary of State, with his almost religious-like zeal on plastic, could apply that to noise pollution and he could apply that to air pollution, then we'd be even more delighted with the progress that's being made.
Karen McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I congratulate the Honourable Member for Wakefield for not just securing this debate, but for her excellent leadership of the Environmental Audit Committee, of which I'm proud to be a member. It is clear, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the public does want us to act on this. Just this week, a long... and as I thought was a very good speech from the Right Honourable Member for Putney. She spoke about her local schools and how enthused school children are about this issue. And just this week I received some brilliant letters from Year 4 pupils at Wickley Academy in my constituency. And it wasn't just that they demonstrated real understanding of the issue, but they were absolutely astonished that things such as black plastic containers could be used for things like ready meals when we know that they just don't get recycled. And they were asking me, how could this possibly be justified? Huge credit must go to the Blue Planet 2, of course, for raising awareness of this. It created a real sort of momentum behind the campaign. At this point, whenever I mention things like Blue Planet, I have to mention the BBC Natural History Unit, which is, of course, based in Bristol. And the people of Bristol deserve some credit for that in some way, I'm sure. But the Blue Planet 2 did bring into our homes in absolutely amazing, vivid detail just how wonderful and extraordinary the habitats and the wildlife in our seas and oceans are, just how precious a natural environment that is. And that made it all the more distressing when we then saw the episode when you saw the sea life being cut open and the plastic being pulled from their stomach. We saw just what terrible damage plastic pollution can do. The government has made the right noises so far, but I would say that action has been limited and slightly disappointing. They have promised a deposit return scheme, which was one of the key recommendations in the report, which I think would be excellent. But in other respects, it's been limited to the low-hanging fruit, such as the wash-off version of microbeads in cosmetic products. They've talked about ending the sale of plastic straws, stirrers and plastic stem cotton buds. Again, I'd like to credit a Bristol organisation, City to Sea, which has been campaigning particularly on the cotton buds for a few years now and has approached all the major retailers and manufacturers. And a lot of them have managed to change their products. So instead of it being plastic, it's got, I think, in many cases, that compacted cardboard or something else that is far more environmentally friendly. The Treasury announced in November and re-announced this spring a call for evidence on changes to the tax system to reduce single-use plastic. And as we've heard with plastic bags, that worked incredibly well. I would be interested to hear the thinking as to what products would be banned and what products would be subject to this kind of surcharge. I think there's a fine line between discouraging the use down to a much smaller level, but still allowing some use and banning the products altogether. The Secretary of State, who generally I'm very happy to support and congratulate on his the progress that he's made on environmental issues. He speaks of making the UK a world leader in resource efficiency. But I have to say there has been a marked lack of enthusiasm coming from his department for the EU Circular Economy package, which could be absolutely transformative, not just in the way we deal with waste and resources, but also in the number of new jobs we could create in a very innovative sector. Most of the really big decisions seem to have been deferred to the already much delayed waste and resources strategy. There are three players when it comes to trying to achieve this sort of systemic change. There's consumers and the choices that they make, and that's important. There's the market and its response to consumer demand or to business opportunities, and we're seeing that happen to an extent. And then there is the role of the state with its ability to regulate, ban, use fiscal incentives or disincentives to set targets to drive forward change. And I do think the government has something of an ideologically driven weakness for the hands-off voluntary approach. Maybe a bit of education, maybe a bit of a nudge, but basically preferring to leave it to consumers and the market, except for those low-hanging fruit that I mentioned. And I believe that this issue is simply too important and too urgent for such an approach. We're destroying our precious planet on a daily basis, and the government needs to show significantly more leadership than it has done so far. For example, the response to our report on coffee cups was quite discouraging. The government recommended our recommendation of a 25p latte levy, which we've already heard about, and most of the rest was deferred off into the long grass where the waste strategy currently resides. I am glad that the parliamentary authorities of this week show more ambition with their plastic-free parliament package, which does include latte levy. I'd particularly like to thank Surfers Against Sewage for their work on this. They've been brilliant. In its response to the EAC report, the government praised the PCA, the Paper Cup Alliance, which is really a rather weak collaboration of big coffee chains and manufacturers. And as the Honourable Member for Putney did, I also have written out to coffee cup chains, and I won't name and shame here, but it was very interesting to see which companies responded in a reasonably positive way and which ones were very dismissive. The Paper Cup Alliance hasn't even set a target for increasing the percentage of coffee cups recycled, and its primary intention seems to be to rebrand coffee cups as paper cups and to get better recognition of them as recyclable. Well, we've already heard that although notionally they are recyclable, there are only, I think, 5 specific facilities in the whole of the UK that can separate that thin plastic membrane from the outer thing. So there's no point going around telling people they can be recycled when in practice they can't. As we've heard, all but 0.25% go to landfill or are incinerated. Clearly there needs to be measures to develop alternatives to the current cups, such as Frugal Pack, and there's a number of those out on the market, as we've heard. I do think that this shows the limits to voluntary action. There was an excellent 2015 report by the RSPB that was called Using Regulation as a Last Resort, and it analysed over 150 voluntary schemes across a range of sectors, and it found that common to the majority of them was unambitious targets, a lack of transparency, no enforcement mechanism, and an inability to attract widespread industry participation and compliance. That's what happens when you leave it to the market. And only recently RAP, which is the body that has been charged with delivering on this agenda by the government, has had to make 1/10 of its staff redundant because of funding cuts. Huge cost. We need a level playing field, and we need the government to act, to regulate, to pass laws so that there is a level playing field. Without that, the best practice businesses such as Boston Tea Party, which is a very small chain of coffee, what do you call them? Shops in cafes. Well, they're cafes, but they do coffees and takeaway coffees in Bristol. That has announced that it's banning all single-use coffee cups later this year. But if it's left just to them, they will lose out commercially to the environmental laggards.
Yeah.
I would like to highlight a couple of key recommendations from the Environmental Audit Committee that we would like to see in the waste strategy later this year. Firstly, a post-2020 target recycling rate of 65%. Even the UK's own estimates have found that this would save almost 10 billion over a decade in the waste sector, greenhouse gas and social costs. Last year, I asked the Environment Minister why the UK's recycling rate had stagnated and whether the government was opposing an EU target to recycle 65% of municipal waste by 2035. She wouldn't confirm or deny this, and she blamed everyone but the government for the UK's poor performance, particularly local authorities, who we know simply don't have the resources to do this, and consumers. Secondly, we need to see manufacturers pay significantly more towards the recycling of the packaging used for their products. Yes. We urgently need a new framework for producer responsibility, which we've heard about. The prevalence of items such as black plastic, Lucozade bottles with their plastic sleeves, the coffee cups that can't easily be recycled, Pringles tubes, I think, are the worst offenders. They're made up of 5 different materials. Each one is notionally recyclable, but you can't actually detach one from the other, so therefore it's pointless. All point to the weakness of the current system. The government used to boast that the UK's system of producer responsibility was run at the lowest cost to business in the EU, but this comes at a cost to society, as cash-starved local authorities and taxpayers are paying 90% of the cost of collection. And that is a complete reversal of the polluter pays principle. Exactly. And thirdly, I would like to highlight the committee's recommendation that the government phases in a mandated minimum 50% rPET content for the production of new plastic bottles by 2023, which would create a UK market for recycled plastic, which at the moment is struggling against low oil prices, which actually makes new plastic cheaper. So in conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, I do hope that we see from the government a radical waste strategy which addresses the stagnating rates of recycling, The inefficiencies arising from so many different recycling collection systems in operation and the poor state of our recycling infrastructure, which has been deprived of investment because of this illogical PRN system. We could be world leaders in waste management and resource efficiency. Now is the time for the government to seize the moment and to act.
Pauline Latham.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I have to apologise to the House and to the Minister to say that I won't be back at the end of the debate because I have got a very pressing engagement in my constituency, so I apologise for that now. I'd like to congratulate the member for Wakefield for securing this debate. It's just such a shame it's on a Thursday afternoon when many people, like myself, need to be in their constituencies. Because it is an important debate that the whole House should be getting behind. I was one of the MPs who decided to try and give up single-use plastics for Lent. Like many, I completely failed. I did my level best. My husband even did his level best because he does the shopping now, and he took other containers to the supermarket to get them without a plastic bag. He took brown paper bags to get them filled. But it wasn't easy. The one lasting difference it's made is we bought a yoghurt making machine and we don't buy yoghurt anymore, we make it ourselves. But it is extremely difficult to manage without single-use plastics. And I saw the Honourable Lady for Wakefield talked about, I think she talked about cups being in the street and things, but did she notice the plastic bottles after the London Marathon? They were dozens deep along the streets. Now that is wrong. We need to keep people like that hydrated, but actually using single-use plastics is such a waste of resources and there should be better ways. Yes, of course I get way.
Very grateful to Honourable Lady for giving way. I was one of the MPs that took part in the London Marathon. In slight defence of the marathon organisers, they did actually trial for the first time this year paper cups along the route as well to try and reduce plastic. So I think she's absolutely right to put that on record. But just in slight defence of the London Marathon, I think they are probably quite mindful of that, and that's why we had quite an innovative time this year.
But I thank the Honourable Member for that point. But there were millions of them on the streets, and that is a total waste of resources. For one quick glug, they were thrown away. And I noticed this week, coming to London from Derby on the train, it was saying on the station, keep hydrated, carry a bottle of water with you. But there is no water to fill your own bottle on the station. We give them bottles of water on the train, and that's unacceptable because they don't recycle them. Yes, I'm wrong.
Would my honourable friend agree with me? I too was on the London Marathon, and having a bottle was far better than having a cup, because when you're jogging along, you're going to bounce a lot of the liquid out the bottle. Wouldn't a really important innovation be if the top and the body of the bottle were both made of the same plastic? That would make recycling easier.
That would make recycling much easier, and I'm sure if we have the machines that will take bottles in the future, we'll get lots of entrepreneurial young people going and getting them and getting the money back. So I think that scheme is a good idea, but actually we need to change the way people behave. We need to stop them using these. I mean, the London Marathon is a difficult case because you do need to keep hydrated when you're running. But there are children, we've heard in the debate earlier from the member for Bristol East and the member for Putney, that children are really interested in this problem and they really care. They need to educate their parents, who tend to throw the rubbish out of the car window. We also need to continue the education when students get to university, because I think once they get to university, they forget many of the lessons they learnt when they were younger. So we need to continue that education and make sure that universities are a place where recycling is very high priority, or not just recycling, but changing the use and people not using the plastics in the first place. And I'm not going to steal the thunder of my honourable friend, who is the chairman of the admin committee, which I sit on, but I would like to say that the steps that the committee have taken at the recommendation of the House authorities, who have done an amazing job, we asked them to look at the problem within the House. They've actually gone a step further, and we're going to have radical change in this place. And the House of Lords have agreed as well, so it'll be right through both houses. So I'm delighted about that, but I'm sure the facts and figures will come later when the honourable member for Mole Valley will be speaking about it. But I'd also like to commend the Foreign Office, because they've made a big impact. They are doing the latte levy. They've improved it from 10p to 50p in the Foreign Office. They have got rid of plastic cups, crockery, cutlery, straws, single-use condiment sachets from all its London staff canteens. And it is also providing reusable or biodegradable alternatives. Now, I'm sorry I won't be here to hear the Minister's answer, because I'm concerned about biodegradable products, because I do believe they just go into smaller pieces and animals and mammals do still eat them, and it's still going to cause a problem. But I think if we can come up with innovative solutions, we can reduce the whole amount of plastic waste. And there was a scheme I read about. A community in the southwest took all their non-recyclable waste back to the supermarket at the end of a month. And that was a huge amount. And to show the supermarket what a huge problem it is. And we heard earlier about things like Pringles, where they're made of 5 different areas. I don't know some of the plastics, whether they're recyclable or not, because the logos on them are very confusing. And I'm interested in the subject, so I think there's a problem for most normal people out there. But instead of us in this House just changing our behaviour, I think every single government department should be instructed to stop single-use plastics, because we can't criticise other people unless the whole of government, in every single department, whether it's in London or whether it's somewhere like Diffid, it's up in Glasgow, we need to stop it throughout government so that we can then say to people, we've put our house in order, will you put yours in order? But I just finally want to finish, because time is short. Instead of just not using the plastics, when plastics are used, we ought to be investing money in trialling ways of reusing these plastics. I understand in Mexico they are building houses with plastic bottles that are very cheap, very sustainable, and will last for 500 years. And I think that we should be investing in this alternative use for plastics if we have to have some of them, instead of just saying, well, we'll burn it or we'll put it into landfill if it can't be recycled. It's really important that this government does lead the world, if you like, but it needs to lead from the front, because we have got a Secretary of State in DEFRA who is incredibly keen on recycling and all things green, and I do commend him for his energy and enthusiasm. But I'm unhappy about 25 years of the environment plan. I'd like to see it much faster, and I would like to see this government looking at investing in alternative technologies to use it. Thank you.
Can I just say that the advice is 7 minutes. Please can we stick to it, because if not, I don't want to impose a time limit. I want to make sure we all get there, especially if people aren't there at the end. Think of the others. Susan Ellen-Jones.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a great pleasure to take part in this debate and to follow the Honourable Lady and other colleagues in participating. And I think for me, it was an email from a constituent that I received in either the latter part of 2010 or the early part of 2011 that made me first think on this issue. And it came just in advance of the Welsh Government introducing a 5p levy on charges towards plastic bags. Now, for many of us, it was both a pioneering step and quite a novel one, and to be honest, we didn't know quite how it would go. My constituent, however, had no doubts. In his view, it was going to be an absolute disaster. He thought it was something which would deprive him of all his liberty, and moreover, he made the point that if the Welsh Government went ahead with this charge, he would have his own boycott and would do all his shopping across the border in England. Now, I didn't want too long a discussion on this with him, but we did end up with a slightly interesting exchange of emails. As I discussed the 4 cloth bags at the back of my car that I always took out with me when I went shopping. And he responded by saying that as a true Briton, as he described himself, and a passionate believer in the liberty of the individual, he thought the plastic bag charge was an absolute outrage. And it made me think at that time then, and it's made me think subsequently, that if people want to bring in changes on issues like this to protect the environment, there are inevitably people with whom it's not going to be popular. Because many of these sort of changes involve everyday changes in terms of our lifestyles. I met someone, I don't know if he was related to the person who had written to me, that had another view on the subject at the time. And that was, it was obvious, wasn't it, that the people of Wales were going to resort to carrying all their shopping in black bin bags. Now, I confess I never did see 2.8 to 3 million people walking around shopping with black bin bags thereafter. But it's an interesting point that when these sort of changes happen, and I think what we've seen, and I know reference has been made to it earlier, there's a younger generation who pick up on this more quickly than those of us of a slightly older generation, because they with their schools, they at school, they with their eco-councils are probably much more instinctively aware on this issue than we are. And of course, as we discuss here today, plastic bottles are a particular case in point. Now, for campaigning radicals, of course, across history, often have taken up the issue of the land. God gave the land to the people. I think it was Michael Foot's favourite campaigning song. But there's been very few references in the English language to water. And as we wax lyrical about water companies and whether they should be privately owned, publicly owned, and the rest of it, I think we forget the fundamental point. The water is totally natural. It comes from the ground, and we can get it from a tap. And I do wonder why we do not make more effort in terms of availability to water fountains and the like. And I think it should be much, much more common in our country. And I really welcome how the Welsh Government is looking at ways of increasing the supply of water fountains and similar outlets so that we can have access to water in this way, because there is no earthly need that we should have to be buying our water through plastic bottles and carrying them around with us. I also think we should be looking at examples from other countries. I can remember when I worked in Japan in the early 1990s, there was a great debate taking place there on waribashi, as they're called in Japanese, disposable chopsticks. And the school children of Japan basically took matters into their own hands, and pretty much every school then decided that the young of Japan would bring in permanent chopsticks that they would carry in little cases to school, and they would use them every day. And the idea caught on. It caught on in companies, and it caught on more widely. And I do wonder if it's time that we did similar by buying bottles where we actually refill them with water, because I see absolutely no reason why we should be having... Yes, certainly.
The Honourable Lady has taken us a slight distance away from the subject at hand, but I have to say I'm always willing to listen to any discussion about disposable Japanese chopsticks. But on the point about water fountains, does she not look around the chamber, and is she not as horrified as I am to see these carafes and these glasses of water? Would it not be an excellent idea to have a water fountain adjacent to the Speaker's chair, perhaps one opposite the two front benches, with disposable biodegradable cups? Let us start as we mean to go on, and let this place be an example to the nation.
I think we'll carry on with using glasses, which is absolutely environmentally friendly. Susan Allen.
Glasses and glass carafes are very environmentally friendly, but the honourable gentleman's, my honourable friend's comments are, of course, very interesting as ever. But I would today make a very, very serious plea on this, is that what struck me is when the honourable gentleman opposite referred to the glass bottle scheme of, I think, the 1970s and 80s, and how we all enjoyed collecting extra pennies from returning these glass bottles. And it was at the time, I think probably the 1970s 70s, it was the Womble generation. There was a great deal of interest in all of this. And sometimes it seems to me we really haven't gone a lot further down that road. And what I would hope is that we redouble our efforts and we look at more ways, whether it comes to plastic bottles or whether it comes to other things. Because if we don't, I think we as a society and we as a world will have far, far greater problems.
Congratulate the Honourable Lady on obtaining this opportunity and raising this debate. And incidentally, all my chopsticks used in my home are reusable and washed, and most of them have been going for about 30 years. The debate is overdue, and I've put that really on having read some years ago about rubbish on Mount Everest and the difficulties they've had. And there was a report, I think last week, of a plastic bag found at the bottom of one of our deepest ocean ravines, and just everything in between. But I want to use a few minutes available to draw members' attention, and it's already been mentioned, of the report that went to the Administration Committee and has been accepted on our, and by that I mean the House of Parliament of Westminster's efforts now, like it or lump it, because it's been through the system, that we're going to get rid of, to the best of our ability, single-issue plastics and single-use plastics. An extensive action paper on this issue was accepted by the Administration Committee and on Monday by the Commission, and last week by the equivalent committees in the other place. Firstly, however, I want to congratulate and thank those members of the officials who took up this challenge on our behalf and were exceptionally imaginative in their ideas. As many members will be aware, we now have a progressive program to remove the single-use plastics. It's going to take us about 12 months. I wrote a letter explaining it to every member, which means about a tenth of them have read it, and I expect complaints, etc. If I can ask members here who are orientated the right way, if they receive complaints, can they put them down and save me having to respond? On the point of view of single-use plastics, all the usual culprits will go. Water will be provided from taps, I can assure the honourable member, instead of water in plastic bottles. Those are going to stop. There will be a tariff on single-use coffee cups. This, of course, is to bully coffee and tea drinkers into use of reusable mugs. Disposable catering items that remain for a while at least will be replaced, and they'll be replaced with compostable materials. Some of these are going to strike us as being really quite unusual and new. For example, salads and similar are currently presented in clear plastic containers. The new ones will look the same, but our officials discovered a source of compostable plastic which was produced, I think, in 2015, which we're going to use and certainly test and see how they go. Now, the team looked beyond catering. Plastic bags were replaced with paper bags. We're implementing a green stationery catalogue. A pilot scheme for reusing packaging for deliveries has commenced. The volume of waste of single-use plastic of delivered goods here is unbelievable. Now, the list of these is not endless, but it's long, so I'm not be tempted in the time I've got available to go through it with all the figures. Interestingly, the Parliamentary Environment Team is now looking at the environmental cost of other materials we use and comparing and contrasting them. In other words, it's a case of watch this space. We've started, we're on the way. Now, I'm an ethnic minority immigrant, as my accent says. I've come from a very small country which can be environmentally friendly to the degree of being paranoid. Our approach in the House of Parliament now fits that approach, and so it should.
Whitfield. I'm grateful, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Mole Valley and to hear of the changes that are coming over the next year to this House. Plastics help make a wide range of very useful, durable, versatile products, and in their own way they do contribute to sustainability. Thanks to plastic, our shampoo bottles don't shatter in the shower when they're dropped, our cars and trucks weigh less and therefore use less fuel, and our homes are better insulated and save energy. And we ship more goods with less packaging than ever before. However, as we have heard today, and I think we all agree, Plastics come with an environmental cost. None of us want to see the plastics or trash of any kind end up in our countryside watercourses and eventually our oceans. And to challenge this end-of-pipe problem has been discussed. Plastics organisations from around the world have joined together in the Declaration of Global Plastics Association for the Solutions on Marine Litter, which is informally known as the Global Declaration. This was completed in 2011, and unfortunately up until now only 75 plastics organisations and allied industries, which represent over 40 countries, have voluntarily signed up to it. And there was a commitment contained in that to take action and, more importantly, to make measurable progress. I draw attention to Networks, an organisation in the central Philippines which deals with recycling ghost fishing nets taken from the oceans, the Plastic Straw Product Stewardship Scheme in the US and North America, and indeed Upcycling the Oceans, the Thailand project to rehabilitate the coastlands by removing the waste from the oceans. And I would like to draw attention to the UK's contribution to this declaration, which is called Operation Clean Sweep. In East Lothian, there is a charity, FIDRA, who are championing plastic waste awareness. They ran campaigns in the past about plastic straws and are now concentrating on nurdles. Nurdles are the small plastic pellets that go around to make the plastic bottles, the coffee cups, and the objects that we see. Nurdles are, in essence, raw plastic, and it's the way that it is transported around the world. And sadly, an astronomically large number of these nurdles escape during this process and end up into our oceans. And like microbeads, once they are in our oceans, they are almost impossible to take out. Indeed, FIDRA have used beach cleanups to raise awareness amongst children. And at Yellowcraig, a particularly beautiful beach in East Lothian, when school children went on a nurdle hunt, they discovered 400 nurdles in just 5 minutes. It's a phenomenal amount to be washed up onto our beaches, and industrial spillage and mishandling is the cause of this nurdle escape. They then float and travel around the world. Operation Clean Sweep seeks to educate industry to provide ways and strategies to reduce their loss and escape. But again, this is an end-of-pipe product. It is before the plastic gets into our chains that we need to look. And this in turn brings me to the types of plastic that we use. We should move to a mandated minimum use of rPET's content into plastic objects. PET is the polyethylene terephthalate which makes up plastic, and when it's recycled, it gets its little R in front of it, and hence rPET. And I wonder whether it's too much to hope that products like coffee cups and water bottles could not contain at least 50% rPET by, say, 2020. Plastic cups are the end product of a process that many good people, charities, businesses and organisations are trying to make sustainable and reusable. I think of the lobster hatchery in North Berwick, founded by Jane McGinn and Davis Grubb and Jack Dale, who see our oceans not as a dumping ground, but as an opportunity for sustainable inshore fishing. Indeed, the award-winning Seabird Centre in East Lothian that sees the results of oceanic plastic pollution miles and miles from these shores. These are the people who are advocating responsibility. But it's our young people and our volunteer groups and charities, and they will not be enough without political and, if necessary, legislative support. The EU is promoting the target of 2030 as the year by which member states should have phased out single-use plastics. The UK's government proposal of a 25-year environment plan appears to be, with all due respect, more of a repackaging of existing policies and previous announcements, and I sincerely hope that the repackaging isn't plastic. It's our children who go to the beach cleans. It's our surfers who use our water. Through the conduits of the plastic whale mentioned early on and the nurdle hunts, these people attack the issue with a passion and an enthusiasm and a commitment. But our young people now who are cleaning beaches will be in their 30s by the time these government policies come in. I think we owe them more than that. Thank you.
Chris. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman, the member for East Lothian, who actually at the beginning of his speech, I thought a fantastic speech all the way through, but particularly at the beginning of the speech highlighting the importance of plastic and how it can improve our environment, I thought was a really important thing to state. So often, Mr Deputy Speaker, I think Bolton West leads the way, sets the agenda, and never more so than when it comes to the environment and recycling. Main speeches often set a strong agenda for honourable and right honourable members, so I hope colleagues won't mind me quoting from Hansard. Our society is yet to recognise that we cannot afford the luxury of wasting so many of our limited resources. We cannot continue forever adopting the short-sighted attitude of a society in which everything must be disposable in the short term at least. Today, we live in a society where the paper cup, the paper tablecloth, and even paper sheets and plastic spoons are taken for granted. We never count the real cost of these items. Planned obsolescence is now accepted by our society, and we are now conditioned not to expect anything to last any length of time. There are many different ways in which our society wastes its resources. For example, every housewife knows when she empties her shopping bag and puts away the shopping, how much paper, rubbish, cardboard, polystyrene and all sorts of other packaging ends up in the dustbin. We have layer upon layer of excessive and expensive packaging, most of which is not needed to maintain the quality of goods we buy. If one only buys a pound of apples in a supermarket today, one buys also a plastic tray and a load of cellophane. The housewife cannot afford the extra cost of all this, and the country cannot afford the waste and misuse of resources in this way. Colleagues may appreciate this wasn't my maiden speech. This was a maiden speech of one of my predecessors, member for Bolton West, Anne Taylor, in 1974, who was speaking about the importance of recycling and not having this consumer throwaway society. So I would look to my colleagues, my friends in the DEFRA department, I think the most exciting, dynamic department we have in Parliament, to continue the work they're doing, to pursue this agenda, and let's not wait until 2062 to have yet another debate on this subject. Let's get there. Let's do it now.
Anna McMahon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. As a member of the Environmental Audit Committee, it's a pleasure to be speaking in this debate, and I'd like to thank the Chair of the Committee, my honourable friend, for securing this debate. Plastic is one of the most successful man-made materials in history and has brought immeasurable benefits to our everyday lives, but we do know that it is causing immeasurable damage to our environment. And back in the 1950s, when mass production of plastic first started, the world produced 2 million tonnes of plastic per year. Now, we're producing over 330 million tonnes. We are now only starting to learn about microplastic, tiny particles which have made their way into the food chain. And a study in the US found that 95% of all adults tested had a known carcinogenic chemical from plastic in their urine. Scientists based at the State University of New York found that 90% of bottled water also contained those microplastics. So we don't know yet for sure what the impact of these microplastics on human health is, but we do know that it's already too late to find a suitable, sustainable alternative. Voluntary return schemes and reusable cups are all great initiatives which I support, but they don't go far enough.
Yeah.
That's why we need a statutory scheme. Sustainability must be enshrined in law. The government must have legally binding environmental limits on plastic waste, air pollution, soil degradation, resource depletion and biodiversity loss. And the 25-year plan includes these, but it does not have any specific short-term targets that this government, this UK government, must act on now. Therefore, the burden is rolled down the line to whoever is appointed as the next Secretary of State, or the one after that, or the one after that. And I'm pleased that in the Environmental Audit Committee, we have now made these concrete proposals that the government can act on, and can act on here and now today. These include the government implementing a producer responsibility structure where companies producing packaging are held accountable for the type of packaging they produce and are burdened with fees when their products fall below our environmental standards. Also, that the government introduces a regulation for all public premises which serve food to provide drinking water on request. This particularly is a reform that is cultural as much as it should be legal, because it means that people will feel comfortable asking for that water to fill reusable bottles or glass cups, using glass cups instead of buying water bottles instead, which will later be disposed of. Since reducing the use of disposable bottles is not a cultural shift that will happen overnight, the government should introduce a deposit return scheme for those drinking bottles, those plastic bottles, to help facilitate those recycling. And the most important point that's been repeated throughout our committee hearings during the committee stages, that during the inquiry, that the changes that the government so aspire to in their 25-year plan need to be enshrined in law with proper short-term targets so that companies have the confidence to invest in these policies, secure in the knowledge that the government has created a legal framework that creates an equal playing field for all. Currently, for businesses to take action, they can face a financial burden. This should not be a cost issue for those at the forefront of action. And the government also needs to establish shorter-term milestones in their plastic reduction targets. A 25-year plan is not enough when imminent action is needed. And that's why we're asking the government that they set a target that all single-use coffee cups disposed of in recycling bins should be recyclable by 2023. We're also asking for the government to set a specific recycling target for disposable coffee cups in their up-and-coming waste and resources strategy, due to be published this year, and that they set a post-2020 recycling rate of 65%. The Environmental Secretary's rhetoric on the issue of curbing plastic waste has been skillful and effective in convincing many that he truly cares about this issue and the environment. He lost no time when he got his new cabinet role as the Environmental Secretary to publish a 25-year plan full of promises that we could all get behind. But it lacks legal certainty that any action will be taken. And that's what we're asking from the government today. Wales has a world-class reputation, and as a special advisor in the Welsh Government for 7 years, I'm proud to have played my part in helping Wales become a leading UK nation for recycling and reducing waste, as well as being now the third best country in the world for recycling. And very proud that we were the first country in the UK to bring in the carrier bag charge. And I agree with my honourable friend here with her tales of that time in bringing in that carrier bag charge. It was truly a difficult time. I was at the forefront of hearing from the great lobby of retailers suddenly understanding and hearing about what this Welsh Government, this little Welsh Government over there, is about to do. So I'm very glad to have helped champion that cause. I'm very glad to see that England followed, only a mere 7 years later. So the Welsh ministers, I'm very pleased that only last week announced key findings of the research on extended producer responsibility, which focused on reducing waste from 6 types of food and drink packaging. This polluter pays principle is absolutely core to resolving many of these issues. So I'd like to finish my speech on a more positive note and just share with the House a campaign we're running in my constituency in Robina on making them the first single-use plastic-free community in Cardiff. And along with local resident Naomi England, our campaign is about encouraging those local businesses to become as plastic-free as possible and offering suggestions for alternatives. And we're working to roll that out across the constituency and to the whole of Cardiff. It's about the community taking advantage of offers, playing their part by reusing bags, bringing reusable coffee cups when they're out and about. But this is no substitute for statutory legislation. But I am particularly proud of one smaller constituent, 7-year-old Nathaniel, who did write to me. He goes to Robina Primary School, and he went home to look at the waste that he and his family used. And he said, we noticed we used a lot of meat trays and fruit and veg trays. We also noticed that these trays cannot be recycled. We also thought that the triangle symbol was very hard to see on some plastics, and we think those labels should be clearer. Well, so do I, Nathaniel, and I thank him for his input, and I hope that this government will listen.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. As a member of the Environmental Inquiry, this was my first large-scale inquiry, the plastic bottles and coffee cups inquiry. I'd like to thank the Chair, my honourable friend, the member for Wakefield, who supported me and the other new members of the committee in this, our first inquiry, and it was such a pleasure to listen to all the evidence coming forward, and it was, I think it's such an influential inquiry actually, that we have managed to influence the House and hopefully soon the government in their policies on plastics. Sometimes when you're sitting in committee, you listen to the evidence, something just quietly dawns on you, and this happened in one of the sessions when I was listening to the One Less campaign. And I asked the project manager One Less campaign, do you think there is scope to look at the likes of takeaways and fast food places that provide access to tap water, because that's the area where you see a lot of littering and food on the go being disposed? And Fiona Llewellyn, who's the project manager of One Less campaign, said, one of the reasons we have plastic packaged water is that it's convenient to have on the go. So we can overcome some of the barriers convenient to refilling. That would be a wonderful step in the right direction, this wider problem of plastic pollution, and what you suggest would be very welcome. So there's something there immediately in terms of planning law that we can implement, which would reduce the use of single-use plastic bottles. So the inquiry brought up a whole load of evidence, and one of the major areas was this area of deposit return scheme, which many members have alluded to. And you would think that all of the manufacturers would be opposed to the deposit return scheme because it is a cost to their business. But many major companies are supportive, one of whom is Coca-Cola, which I believe is the world's largest drinks company. And they put out in evidence to the committee their support for the scheme. And they actually had a number of recommendations to us, which were that we should just have a single scheme, that the scheme should be managed by a not-for-profit organisation, and the cost is most amazing. The cost should be covered by producers and retailers. And that isn't us as a committee or a lobby group or even the government. That is one of the world's largest companies, one of the world's largest producers of plastic bottles. So surely if we can listen to them, who we would normally think would be on the other side of the debate. One of the other things that happened while we were doing the inquiry was the announcement that China would no longer accept plastic waste imports, and we had a separate session on Chinese plastic waste. But the Chinese waste ban does create issues in terms of where do all these plastic bottles go, so we do not have the reprocessing capacity. And one of the things that we also looked at was package recovery notes, and the area I'm going to concentrate on is package export recovery notes, PERNs, which are the licences that you need to export plastic waste abroad. And clearly we're not having any of these for China because there's a waste ban. But PERNs, for instance, to go to Vietnam, it's difficult to have a clear audit trail of what happened to the plastic. And actually, we had evidence from Zero Waste Vietnam who said, why can't European countries recycle their own plastic materials? Why are we having to have shiploads of plastic materials which we are not able to recycle?
Some anxiety there with
I said shiploads, boatloads of plastic material. For the record, it's boatloads of plastic material. Zero Waste Vietnam, a very proper organisation. They would not resort to any foul language. So, anyway, coming back to the point. So, local organisation has, presented us with evidence that the plastic that we are exporting may not be being recycled, and that is the point of these export recovery notes.
Would my honourable friend give way?
I think I will.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. I was just going to mention, with regard to recycling, that one of the great challenges is the bottles and the containers themselves being dirty when they go into the system and thus pollute whole loads. And one of the great behavioural changes that we need to adopt is the ability to clean these ourselves before we submit them to recycling.
Well, I certainly don't think we want to see boatloads of dirty waste. So I completely agree with my honourable friend on that point. So I think that we also need a complete actual audit of our PERN system and look at reform, because if we're to export plastic, which I don't actually agree with personally, then we need to know that that plastic is going to be recycled when it arrives. I'd like to thank, although he's not in his place, the honourable member for Mole Valley, and I did read his letter very carefully this morning. I do have a copy of his letter, and I think actually the Administration Committee's recommendations aren't really recommendations just for this House. They are actual recommendations that the government should be considering. They are actually very holistic in their approach to how we should tackle plastic. They're talking about ending sales of plastic bottles for water. The latte levy. We will have a latte levy here. We will not have a latte levy outside here, but we'll have one here. Incentivising use of recycled cups through loyalty. Getting rid of condiment sachets. And I was amazed to read how much sauce we eat in this place. We eat 334,800 sachets of sauce. We are a saucy lot in this house. So I really thank the Administration Committee and hope that the government will take on some of their saucy suggestions.
It is HP sauce.
Absolutely. So I also feel like a lot of personal responsibility in this area. I recently made a visit to I Am Donna, my local kebab shop in Headingley, where I ordered my normal falafel wrap, and they told me actually that they have gone completely plastic free. They provide water in cans. All of their packaging is non-plastic. They are an exemplar to all of us. So I'd like to thank Paul I Am Donna for introducing that, and it's inspired me, and I am going to actually have a week where I do not buy any single-use plastic, and I will be unfortunately bombarding honourable members on my social media accounts with how difficult it will be, because I'm sure it will be, to avoid any single-use plastic. I'm hoping the Administration Committee can hurry up so I can eat here without having to utilise any single-use plastic. But I think we all need to make a personal commitment as well as pressing for change from the government. Thank you.
Leeds North West. I'm pretty sure when this is replayed on BBC Parliament, it will probably be on after the watershed. But I want to pay tribute to the Honourable Lady, the member for Wakefield, for opening the debate, and to thank the Liaison Committee for securing time for us to debate this. Unusually, I want to pay tribute to the Private Parliamentary Secretary, the Honourable Gentleman for Thurston Malton, who is in his PPS spot, but this week he came along to meet with a number of children who'd come down from Glasgow, who've been doing some fantastic work. It's the children at Sunnyside Primary, which is actually my mother's old primary school. They're much more innovative now. But they come down, they're known as the Sunnyside Ocean Defenders, and they've really been making waves in Scotland around the whole issue of their campaign for nae straw at all, and I can clarify that for Hansard later on. But it's really this desire to see a reduction in the use of single-use plastic straws, whilst also being mindful of people with disabilities still being able to have access to that. And so I really want to pay tribute to those kids who came down here, challenged at a huge number of MPs on this issue. I think sometimes these issues are a bit popular, but these children are absolutely determined. And what reaffirmed that for me was later on in the afternoon, they had a meeting with McDonald's, and they're running a campaign at the moment called Pretty Deadly, and it's about these marketing gimmicks that they do, you know, the balloons that they give away. Now, I can't think of many other companies in the world that have a more iconic brand than McDonald's. So I think the kids quite rightly made a real challenge to McDonald's about, you know, why are you using these, you know, plastic balloons that go away and, you know, sometimes end up in Norway or whatever. And one of the things that I was quite challenged by not that long ago was during Easter recess, I went on holiday to Tunisia and I was in Hammamet. And this follows on from the point from the Honourable Lady, the member from Derbyshire, who's no longer in our place. But one of the things that I was quite conscious of when we're travelling throughout certain parts of Tunisia, happy to give it, Honourable Gentleman.
Just pay tribute to the Sunnyside Ocean Defenders. Those young students were passionate, they were so engaged and so knowledgeable, and it weren't just interested in plastics, it was so many different things in the world, the planet they wanted to improve, including, for example, polar bears, make sure we protect our polar bears, and I remember very clearly they wanted to ban wild animals in circuses, which is something the department is very keen to do as well. So can I thank him for bringing those children down and pay tribute to school and those children.
I find he is, as ever, characteristically incredibly kind, and I'm sure that will be of great encouragement to him. And I want to thank him as well for passing on a personalised plastic bottle, reusable plastic bottle, I must add, to the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and the kids really appreciated that, so I'm very grateful. Now, I do want to touch on one or two concerns that I do have, as you might expect, Mr Deputy Speaker, as we approach Britain's exit from the European Union, because you know, we on these benches believe that the SNP government is leading the way on tackling waste, but this cannot be threatened by the government's attack on the devolution settlement. We very much support the EU Commission's vision that all single packaging should be easily recycled or reusable by 2030. And I think we would say that devolution has been vital to ensuring that environmental policies and objectives are tailored to our ambitions in Scotland to meet those needs. And I would be concerned that any power grab from the UK government could inhibit that. But I am conscious of time, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I did promise you that I was not going to ramble on. So the other point that I just wanted to make, and it was really to finish up where I started with these children. Sunnyside Primary is a school of conservation, and I'm incredibly proud of that. But unusually, when you find schools, they have, you know, Latin kind of mottos, but the motto of Sunnyside Primary is, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. And I think we as legislators, when we are making decisions in this House, that's something that should always be at the forefront of our minds.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I also say that as a member of the EAC, I too would like to thank the Backbench Business and the Liaison Committee for allowing this crucial debate, the concerns that we have, to be debated today, and in particular to praise the superb, the diligent work of our staff, our committee members, led by our chair, the member for Wakefield, who is an absolute pleasure to serve under her chairmanship. Mr Deputy Speaker, if I may, I'd like to comment on some earlier points made by members. The chair of the EAC herself made fine points on Norway's scheme, and I will mention Norway in a minute or two in my speech. But in particular, her points on the polluter pays principle is not lost to me. I would urge all local authority and organisations to actually write to the tobacco industry and ask them if they could plunder their war chest, because I believe they have a sizable amount of money for environmental issues. I was also very impressed with the member of Putney. She demonstrated how business and communities are fully behind the whole recycling scheme. And there are very many other excellent contributions, ideas from all sides of the House. The member for Bristol East mentioned the Blue Planet programme. I'm very grateful to the Bristol programme makers producing such a high-level, quality-raising awareness narrative that brought the seriousness of this issue into our living rooms. And my honourable friend here, the member for Glasgow East, has shown just how important it is for members to work with their own school children. Mr Deputy Speaker, the EC Select Committee recommendation on plastic bottles and disposable coffee cups are both achievable and they are sensible. And if we need proof, which we shouldn't and we don't, but just let me say there are packaging deposit return schemes for plastic bottles and coffee cups already being carried out in 38 countries worldwide. Some, such as Germany, which, as we know, has a huge economy, a large population, have managed to increase their packaging recycling rates to more than 90%. So it begs the question, what's stopping this government from taking further steps? Mr Deputy Speaker, arguably the best example is Norway's deposit return scheme. Their DRS achieved an enviable and staggering plastic recycling rate of 97% within 3 years of its launch. Furthermore, the Norwegian government decided the best method would be to put a tax on every bottle that's not recycled. Then leave the operating details of the scheme up to businesses, a clear sign of respect and trust from all sides to do the right thing and to accept responsibility. Norwegian shopkeepers and the public say they generally favour the scheme because they are paid a small fee for each return bottle and further benefit from the increased footfall when consumers return bottles and spend the money in their stores. That is good business. Operators of the scheme outline that it is more appropriate and sensible for people to pay for drink bottles to be recycled rather than taxpayers having to pay for litter to be cleaned on streets and beaches. Clearly, Norway has taken cognizance of human behaviour. Mr Deputy Speaker, human behaviour is the impartial spectator within us. It sees morality of our actions. It is that conscience, the person within that is the great judge and the arbiter of our conduct, and tells us all that we are doing something wrong, and we have been. The Norwegian government have clearly been mindful of that and acted accordingly. So why aren't we going further? So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I just want to turn to Sweden for a minute. In 1984, Sweden introduced a deposit return scheme. Interestingly, in Sweden, the process is known as panta, which I believe means to return to something and get money in return. In the early 2000s, Sweden created catchy commercials featuring musicians to raise awareness and incentivise people to panta more. Good creative thinking, Mr Speaker, nudging people by creating a word for the scheme, and the public love it. Sweden now recycles something like 85% of its aluminium cans and PET bottles through their DRS scheme. Mr Speaker, I believe in contrast, as was mentioned earlier, the UK recycles only an estimated 57%. All the environment groups say that the key to reducing waste in the UK is to economically incentivise consumers by placing a deposit in bottles. This in turn will make people less inclined to throw away that money and instead recycle. All of us in all parts of the UK recognise the litter problem in this country of single-use coffee cups and plastic bottles. It is an absolute national embarrassment. But, Mr Speaker, Scotland has come to similar conclusions as the EAC, and the Scottish Government and business community are already taking steps. For example, the Scottish Government has set up a panel of experts to advise on policy developments to tackle plastic pollution, disposable cups and plastic straws. Mr Deputy Speaker, I think we all agree that this experts panel, which includes experts in human behaviour, economics, sustainable business, biotech and chemicals, environmental law, waste management and advisers representing the interests of young people and the disabled. This is a truly all-encompassing group, and it clearly demonstrates the manner in which the Scottish Government is tackling the problems in Scotland. The Scottish Government absolutely supports, as my honourable friend has just said, the EU's Commission that the vision that all plastic packaging should be easily recyclable by 2030. It's 255 at the moment. Mr Speaker, devolution has been vital to ensuring environmental policies and objectives are tailored to our ambitions in Scotland and to the Scottish needs. Any change to our policies to Scotland's distinctive and ambitious approach to environmental standards, regulations and climate change is completely unacceptable. We were the first country in the UK to commit to introducing a deposit return scheme for drink containers. Mr Speaker, we are good neighbours, so let the Westminster Government leave responsibilities where they lie within the devolved governments and let the parties work together. Mr Speaker, as we have heard, there are innovative companies, large and small, are competing to bring biodegradable or recyclable alternatives to commonplace products to market. For example, it's now possible to get a toothbrush which is made of recyclable bamboo from a local shop. I think that's an absolutely wonderful invention. There are now a clutch of young companies selling beeswax soap cloth wraps as an alternative to cling film and aluminium foil for food storage. Publishing giant Penguin Random House have joined a new campaign reducing plastics in the book industry. Authors for Oceans ask publishers and readers to reduce the amount of plastic they use. The campaign presents greener choices to plastic-lined jiffy bags, and I believe, as has been mentioned earlier, Wakefield's donated something like £1 million to Conservation Society beach and river clean-ups, as well as marine and plastic research and an innovative challenge fund. In my own Falkirk constituency, the makers of Scotland's other national drink, Barzire and Brew, were so far-sighted they had a deposit return scheme before I was even born. Tomorrow I'm looking forward to visiting Coca-Cola in East Kilbride. Tesco and Asda and Falkirk I visited recently to see what they were doing in their local communities and what actions they were taking. Mr Speaker, we stand at a privileged, Deputy Speaker, we stand at a privileged moment in time at the forefront of a socio-economic transition as it gains global momentum. The door is already ajar. We only need to push it. Countries, businesses, large and small, and individuals around the world have stopped fooling themselves about the need to put the world economy on a sustainable footing. Corporate responsibility is not now a last-moment thought. It is at the heart and the core of ethical business thinking and policy. The dots have lined up, and we cannot ignore the picture they create. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, these companies and organisations, they need certainty of policy to invest their time and money securely. This government is in a good position to give this certainty with broad agreement across the whole political spectrum. The Secretary of State for the Environment tells us there is no doubt that plastic is wreaking havoc on our marine environment. Surely a cross-party agreement and agreements with the devolved administrations would not be too hard to achieve. Here in this Parliament, as we've heard earlier, the Administration Committee is in the process of implementing the EAC's recommendations and more. Over the next few months, we shall see the end of sales of water and plastic bottles. A latte levy has been mentioned earlier, and throughout the whole estate, packaging is to be replaced with compostable or reusable alternatives. This committee, Mr Deputy Speaker, has actually made, if you want the thing happen, if you want to change the world, you get busy in your own little corner. This EAC committee has done just that. And on a personal note, I would like to see a colour-coded traffic light system introduced on cups and bottles, matching a harmonised bin infrastructure appropriate to the matching colours, and remove the existing confusion to the public where they place these single items in bins. I will finish in a quote. My quote is from my chair. The UK's throwaway culture is having a devastating impact on our street, beaches and seas. Our report recommended practical solutions to the disposable packaging crisis. The government response shows that despite warm words, they plan no real action. I agree entirely with that statement and couldn't put it better.
Suhaib.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'd like to start by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Wakefield, not just for securing what I think we would all agree has been an excellent debate, but also for her valuable and extensive work on this area of policy. And I would also like to thank the other members of the Environment Audit Committee who've taken part in this debate today, the Honourable Member for Bristol East, the Honourable Member for Cardiff North, the Honourable Member for Leeds North West and the Honourable Member for Falkirk, for the work that they've also done in bringing this important report to the House. We've also had contributions from the Honourable Member for East Lothian, and the Honourable Member for Clwyd South brought a very interesting Welsh perspective to the debate. Mr Deputy Speaker, when it comes to tackling plastic waste, I believe that this House is united in recognising the need for action. The UK uses 13 billion plastic bottles every year, yet only 7.5 billion are recycled. This means that the remaining 5.5 billion are either landfilled, littered or incinerated. And as the Environmental Audit Committee report highlighted, if marine plastic continues to rise at its current rate, the amount of plastic in the sea will outweigh fish by 2050. I don't know who weighs the fish. While it is imperative that we do all we can domestically to tackle plastics ending up in our seas. We must also bear in mind that ocean pollution is a global issue, requiring international cooperation and leadership. So as long as there are countries and communities with inadequate or non-existent waste disposal infrastructure, littering and waste will continue to pollute our oceans. So would the Minister confirm the amount of deferred spending that department has put towards improving waste infrastructure in developing countries over the last 12 months? And on to coffee cups. We've heard that the mix of plastic and paper in the lining of our disposable coffee cups makes them very difficult to recycle. And currently that only a small number of specialist plants in Britain are able to process disposable coffee cups. And this means, Mr Deputy Speaker, that over 99% of disposable coffee cups used in Britain do not get recycled. And that's why the committee's call for more research into recyclable coffee cups is so important, as well as the call for greater clarity and awareness raising on how coffee cups can be recycled. The problem is there remains significant public belief that coffee cups are still easily recyclable along with other paper or plastic items, when in fact we know they cannot be disposed of within household recycling. And on plastics, Labour supports the committee calls for a plastic bottle deposit return scheme, and this support was something that was outlined in our last manifesto. And while behavioural change and reducing the consumption of single-use plastics is undoubtedly important, we must not lose sight of the bigger picture on waste and recycling, of which consumer behaviour is just one part. Currently, packaging producers only pay for 10% of the cost of packaging disposal and recycling. This leaves taxpayers to foot the bill for the remaining 90%. And we've heard from honourable members today about the weakness of the current producer responsibility obligations, with our fees being amongst the lowest in Europe. And we know that the PRN system is far from optimal and that local authority practice in recycling varies quite wildly. So a comprehensive and effective strategy from government cannot just rely on righteous indignation and sound bites. We need comprehensive, ambitious reform on waste and recycling to look at many of the systemic, design and infrastructure barriers to waste reduction and recycling right across the UK. And never has this been so urgent as it is now, with the UK leaving the EU in only a few months, and also, as we've heard, in light of the Chinese ban on dry recycling imports from the UK. And while we've heard numerous promises and press releases, not one piece of primary legislation has been brought forward by DEFRA to date, despite the fact that, as I said, we are only now months away from leaving the European Union. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm afraid this is not bringing confidence in the assertions that are coming from the Secretary of State that environmental standards are not at risk with Brexit and that the UK is well prepared. Last week we saw yet another consultation launched, this time an Environmental Principles and Governance Bill. But Sean Spears, the chair of Greener UK, says that these proposals give the environment and countryside less protection after Brexit than exists now. And given the emphasis by the Environmental Audit Committee on the importance of the polluter pays principle, will the Minister confirm whether the precautionary and polluter pays principles will be enshrined in law before the UK leaves the EU? How can the Secretary of State credibly claim to be upholding and improving environmental standards after Brexit when the environmental watchdog he is proposing has been described by environmental experts as toothless and lacking adequate scope and powers? Only yesterday, the other place voted to ensure existing environmental standards are maintained, recognising this inadequacy. The government's plan that was announced in January to eliminate all avoidable plastic by 2042 is all well and good. But will the Minister confirm today whether this plan is on track to be delivered? And does he believe that this ambition could be and should be achieved sooner and in line with EU targets? To summarise, Mr Deputy Speaker, I would like to once again welcome this important work that the Environment Audit Committee has done on single-use plastics and coffee cups and for their leadership in this area. We must use the current wave of public opinion to make lasting and meaningful change on recycling and waste, and ensure that environmental standards in the UK are both protected and strengthened in legislation, and not just in government press releases.
Minister George Eustace.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I also begin by congratulating the Honourable Member for Wakefield for securing this debate, following her committee's report on plastic bottles and on disposable coffee cups. And I think today it's fair to say that we've had a number of very thoughtful and detailed contributions. There's clearly a cross-party consensus on the challenge that we are seeking to address, and indeed a consensus that this is an issue that affects the whole UK, with members from all parts of the UK contributing. This government is determined to address the problem of plastic pollution. The Marine Conservation Society Great British Beach Clean project showed in their 2017 report that on average in the UK there are 718 pieces of litter collected for every 100-metre stretch of beach that they surveyed. Litter from eating and drinking or on-the-go goods made up 20% of all the rubbish found on our beaches, which shows the scale of the problem that we have. As a number of honourable members have pointed out, there's been a huge rise in public consciousness on this issue, and I especially want to acknowledge the producers of Blue Planet 2 for their revealing documentary series, which has done huge amounts to raise public awareness about this challenge. A number of honourable members, including my honourable friend, the member for Putney, and others, have talked about the work that schools in their constituency are doing in this area. Let me take this opportunity to acknowledge a couple of schools in my constituency for their work. A few weeks ago, pupils from Portreath Primary School travelled all the way from Cornwall up to London to brief MPs on some of the work they were doing to encourage suppliers to their school to reduce their use of single-use plastics in their packaging. And just recently as well, I faced a concerted campaign from pupils from the Mount Hawke Academy who were campaigning for Parliament to do more. And Cornwall is also the home of Surfers Against Sewage, which is a national campaigning organisation on marine pollution, and we're at the forefront of the campaign to try to get parliamentary authorities to do more here to reduce our use of plastics. And that campaign has been a success, and I'm sure that all honourable members would want to welcome the steps that the parliamentary authorities have announced they're taking this week to reduce the use of single-use plastics, including plastic water bottles and disposable cups. It is also good to see their intention to increase the availability of water dispensers. It is this government's ambition to be the first generation to leave the natural environment in a better state than we found it. The 25-year Environment Plan that we published in January this year outlines the steps we propose to take to achieve our ambition. A central part of the plan is the aim to use resources more wisely and to radically reduce the waste we generate. And here, I would say, our approach is contrary to that painted by the Honourable Member for Bristol East, because we do believe and recognise that sustainable growth can go hand in hand with less waste and a better use of resources. We need to shift our economy away from one of making, using and disposing to one where we can keep our resources in circulation for longer and maximise the value we get from them. We also want to reduce the environmental impacts of products by promoting reuse, remanufacturing and recycling. The plan also includes the Secretary of State's 4-point plan for specifically tackling plastic waste. That is, cutting the total amount of plastic in circulation, reducing the number of different plastics in use, improving the rate of recycling, and supporting comprehensive and frequent rubbish and recycling collections, and making it easier for individuals to know what goes in the recycling bin and what goes into general rubbish. More detail will be announced in our resources and waste strategy, which we will publish later this year, but we are already working to deliver this ambition. We agree with the Environmental Audit Committee that more needs to be done to increase the recycling of plastic drink bottles. That is why we intend to introduce a deposit return scheme, aimed at boosting recycling rates and reducing littering of not just plastic bottles, but other drink containers, subject to a consultation later this year. As the Honourable Member for Falkirk pointed out, there is a lot of work being done right across the UK. And the Honourable Member for Cardiff North invited us to look at some of the work being done in Wales. And in the case of Scotland, we are aware, in particular, that the Scottish Government has been working and looking at deposit return schemes for some time now. And we are certainly keen to work with them and learn from the work that they've done to date. We also agree that making drinking water more readily available in public places will help reduce the use of single-use plastic bottles, and we're already taking action on this too. Water companies, through Water UK, have been working to create a network of water refill points across England, and we are working with them on this. Water companies in England have committed to publishing their plans for reducing single-use plastic bottles in September 2018. My honourable friend and ministerial colleague, the member for Suffolk Coastal, has also written to a wide range of coffee chains, supermarkets, larger airports and transport hubs to encourage installation of free water bottle refill points. There has been a positive response, with most airports confirming they have refill points, coffee chains and supermarkets committing to their installation. And I know that my honourable friend, the member for Mid-Derbyshire, highlighted the challenge on train stations, where we are encouraging people to have water, but they're not necessarily providing the facilities for them to top up. Network Rail are installing a trial refill point in Charing Cross Station, with more to follow at another 16 stations they manage in England if the pilot is successful. Now, the government itself has committed to removing all consumer single-use plastics from the central government estate offices. Within the DEFRA group, we've removed single-use plastic cups and are setting a requirement that new catering services exclude all single-use plastics. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office, as was noted earlier in the debate, have also taken early steps to eliminate single-use consumer plastics from their procurement, and we will be looking to other departments to follow this lead. I turn now to the issue of plastic straws and cotton buds. We are already taking steps towards reducing the scourge of unavoidable plastic waste, with our pioneering microbeads ban and with the 5p charge on carrier bags. But we recently announced that we would go further and that we would consult later this year on a potential ban on the sale of plastic straws, plastic drink stirrers and plastic-stemmed cotton buds in England. We recognise that in some circumstances, plastic straws are the only viable option for some consumers. For example, people with certain disabilities and other medical conditions. So we would be looking closely at providing exclusions for straws used for medical and other essential reasons when the legislation is introduced. This brings me now to the issue of coffee cups, which dominated much of our debate. We also want to see a significant reduction in the use of disposable coffee cups. I've seen some reports in the media that the government has apparently rejected the latte levy that the honourable member for Wakefield talked of. This is not true. We genuinely have an open mind. Clearly, the 5p single-use plastic bag charge has had a big impact, and far fewer are being sold today. These types of incentives can change consumer behaviour, and that is why, in his spring statement, the Chancellor launched a call for evidence, which closes tomorrow, but which seeks views on how the tax system or charges could reduce the waste from a broader range of single-use plastics. The call for evidence is clear that we will consider a levy on disposable cups, and we are seeking views on this idea as part of that call for evidence. However, I also think we should give credit to the coffee and other retail chains where they are taking the initiative on increasing recycling of disposable cups. We are encouraged by the action being taken by packaging companies and retailers, for example, as part of the Paper Cup Recovery and Recycling Group. I know that more than 100 local authorities have already signed up, and we would encourage more to join. I also understand that some coffee retail chains are already taking action to reduce single-use coffee cups by offering discounts to customers with reusable cups, and are putting in place the infrastructure to ensure that cups can be collected for recycling. And I welcome the announcement by Costa Coffee that by 2020 they will recycle 500 million disposable cups, the equivalent of their yearly sales. Now, there are some recommendations in the EAC report that we disagree with. For instance, we don't agree with the recommendation that the government should ban disposable cups unless 100% of those disposed of in recycling bins are not recycled in the next 5 years. And the reason for this, I think, was touched upon by the Honourable Member for East Lothian, who made the point about some of the challenges created by contamination. Targets need to be challenging, but they also have to be realistic and obtainable. And we believe that a 100% recycling from collection is unobtainable, as there will always be contamination in the waste stream, either from the beverage itself or from other items disposed of alongside the cup. However, we do recognise that targets and incentives can be critical to successfully driving the right behaviour, and we recognise the need to stimulate markets for secondary materials as part of our resource and waste strategy. So as part of that strategy, we will look at the whole system from end to end to make sure that it is working effectively through a range of push and pull factors. The Honourable Member for Wakefield touched on the producer responsibility schemes, as did a number of other honourable members, and pointed out some of the weaknesses. Here, I think she'll be happier with the government's position, in that we have already committed to reviewing our current producer responsibility schemes so that they can better incentivise producers to be more resource efficient. We aim to reform the packaging waste regulations to encourage businesses to design their packaging products in a more sustainable way, to encourage the greater use of recycled materials in those products, and to stimulate the increase of collection, reprocessing and recycling of packaging waste. As part of our upcoming resources and waste strategy, we will set out options for this kind of packaging waste producer responsibility system that we think will best deliver our ambitions. We want to support people being able to recycle more and to encourage people to recycle on the go. And we outline some actions to support this in our litter strategy. In addition, RAP has produced a guide for local authorities on improving recycling on-the-go facilities. Finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, we have established a working group to explore and identify best practice in improving bin infrastructure. I can tell the Honourable Lady my speech uses bin infrastructure, the new word as she did, but for the benefit of Hansard, I'll not abbreviate it. But there is certainly a great deal that we can do in that area. So to conclude briefly, we do believe this is a very important issue. Our resources and waste strategy will address many of these issues. We also have consultations coming up on banning plastic straws, plastic stirrers and cotton buds, and a consultation on introducing a deposit return scheme. So I believe, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Government is taking these reports seriously, taking this issue seriously, and we can work together to achieve these aims.
Mary Cray.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and can I warmly thank the Minister for his remarks. I would say on the disposable coffee cup ban, of course you have to set a target that is not just realistic and achievable, it has to be set on just the right side of impossible if you want industry to make the changes that we all in this House want to see. And while I welcome his warm words, I would exhort him to move quickly on the action. As colleagues have said, the waste and resources strategy is now overdue and is slipping back. We've had some excellent contributions today from people talking about how they're thinking globally but acting locally, from the Right Honourable Lady for Putney, the Putney Plastics Pledge, my colleague from Bristol East talking about the great work of City to Sea and Surfers Against Sewage, the Honourable Lady for Mid Derbyshire talking about giving up her difficulties giving up plastic for Lent and her reflections on the London Marathon, the difficulties that the Japanese had banning single-use chopsticks from my honourable friend the member for Clwyd, and the gentleman from Mole Valley telling us that we can look forward to a green stationery catalogue, which is a genuine innovation in this place. A reflection from Bolton West that 40 years ago, our colleague who now sits in the other place was reflecting on plastics use. The Honourable Lady, the member for Cardiff North, telling us how Wales got to be that have the third highest recycling rate in the world. And I'm looking forward to my invitation from my honourable friend, the member for Leeds North West, to go to I Am Donna, where I hope we'll be able to pump out some sauce, which he certainly did in his speech. And the honourable gentleman for Glasgow East, talking about the fantastic work of Sunnyside School. We know what we have to do. Our report says how we have to get there, and we know what we need to do. Our report points the way to create jobs, stimulate a circular economy, not a linear economy, and do the right thing with a higher recycling rate. We want to see the polluter pay. I would like to see the gum and the cigarette butt producers putting their part in as well. And waste has for too long been a Cinderella industry. We're bringing it out, we're taking it into the limelight where it belongs, to create green jobs in every nation and every region of this country. Thank you.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye.